Hi, I'm Lewis Quayle, data scientist, bioinformatician and maintainer of lewisdoesdata.com, my website where I blog data science tutorials and guided data analyses. Today I'm going to be doing a tutorial about how to start, structure and manage projects using RStudio and best practice version control tools Git and GitHub. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Git or GitHub and want to learn, I'll put a link to the series of tutorials that I wrote on these subjects in the post that will accompany this tutorial on my blog, along with a quick guide on how to set up an RStudio project without using version control so that you can familiarise yourselves with the fundamentals before getting started with GitHub. My preferred and recommended way of starting an RStudio project uses Git and GitHub because I believe that version control is the cornerstone of good project management. The first thing that we're going to have to do is to log into GitHub, which you can do in the top right hand corner here. Now if you don't have an account, you can click the sign up button and follow the short series of on-screen instructions in order to set one up. Once you've logged into your GitHub account, we're going to use the repositories screen, which you can find in this menu in the top right hand corner, and go to your repositories. And then we're going to click on this green new button here. On the repository creation page, you can enter a repository name as well as a description for your repository. You can also set access permissions, either public or private, and you can also add a readme, license and .gitignore file to your repo. As a general rule of thumb, you should name your repository using the date and a short but descriptive project title. I'm going to name my repository using the ISO 8601 formatted date for the day that I'm recording this tutorial. And then I'm going to add an intuitive project descriptor, so our project setup. Next, I'm going to ensure that my project is visible to everybody by ensuring that this public button is clicked. And then scrolling down, I'm going to add a .gitignore file, and I'm going to add the GitHub R language gitignore template. Gitignore files instruct the Git version control tool about which files in your project should be tracked and which should be ignored by version control. And the GitHub template that I've chosen to use has some really sensible default options for this. Once you're done, you can click the Create Repository button at the bottom of the page. On this page, you'll see a counter showing the number of commits or changes that have been logged in the repository history. The repository that we've just created has one entry, which is the initial commit to the log that we've just made by creating the repository and adding our .gitignore file. Now we're going to make a small change to the .gitignore file. If we click over here where it says .gitignore, a new page will open up which shows the contents of the .gitignore file. If we click in this top right hand corner where the pencil symbol is shown, we can actively edit the file. Now, scroll to the bottom of the newly opened editor and add the following lines of code. The first one will detail additional user-defined directories. To which we're going to add the data and results directories, and I'll explain more on this shortly. And then the final addition for Mac users will be user-defined files, and we're going to add the .dsstore file, which the macOS operating system has an annoying habit of creating everywhere. Now we can add a commit message in order to remind ourselves and anyone else viewing the project in future what changes were made at this point in the project history. So I'm going to say updated.gitignore. And then we can add these to the project history log by clicking Commit Changes. You should now see, by scrolling down, that the changes that we have just made have been added to the .gitignore file, and that an additional entry has been added to the repository history. So we can see here we have an entry that says updated.gitignore. The additions that we've just made will instruct the Git version control tool to ignore the entire data and results directories of the project that we will soon create, and also those irritating .dsstore files that I mentioned. At this point, I should probably explain why I choose to ignore the data and results directories, and it's as simple as this. Your project raw data, which will be housed in the data directory of your project, should exist in a minimum of 3 places. 2 of these should use different storage media, and 1 should be a remote storage repository. This is otherwise known as the 3-2-1 backup strategy. GitHub isn't really suitable for this purpose as it's intended for code and has a single file upload limit of 100 megabytes. And many projects will have raw data that exceed this size, so it's a good idea to use a more appropriate means of remotely storing your data, such as cloud storage. We ignore the results directory as we should generally treat results as disposable. Now what I mean by this is that if we ensure that our raw data is safely and correctly stored and backed up, and we're correctly managing our project source code, ideally using version control tools, then there shouldn't be any need to worry about results files because these can always be regenerated as required using these other 2 elements. Okay, so now that I've explained a little bit of data management theory, let's look at setting up our project. In order to use the repository that we've just set up to make an RStudio project, we'll have to go back to the repository top level. The next thing we have to do is go over to this code button, ensure that this tab SSH is highlighted, and then click the copy button to copy the URL of the repository. For this to work, you will have had to set up SSH authentication keys for your GitHub account, and there's a set of instructions for how to do this in my Git tutorials that will be linked in the video description and the blog post accompanying this tutorial on my website. The reason we're using the SSH connection option to clone the repository is that GitHub stopped supporting the HTTPS method in August 2021. Now that we've copied the URL, we can open RStudio and start a project. Once you have an RStudio session open, you can start a new project either by clicking the Create Project button here, or going File, New Project. When the new project wizard opens, instead of clicking New Directory, we're going to click Version Control, then click the Git menu, and then we're going to paste in the repository URL that we just copied. Notice that RStudio automatically recognizes the repository name that we gave earlier. Now, all we have to do is make sure that the project is being created in the desired location. In my case, I'm going to ensure that the path creates the project as a subdirectory of my data science working projects folder. Then once you've done that, go ahead and click Create Project. The project will be cloned from your GitHub account and then simultaneously opened. Once you create your project, you should see that the working directory path displayed in the header bar of the RStudio console is the path to your project top level directory, and the same directory should be open in the File Explorer of RStudio, displaying the project contents. The first thing that I do at this point is make a commit to the Git log to record the initialization of the R project. In order to do this, we'll have to go to the Git tab at the top right hand corner of RStudio, and then we'll stage the addition of the R project file by clicking this button here, and then we can commit that to the Git log by clicking commit. A new window will pop up at this point, enabling you to enter a commit message. So I'm going to say initialized R project. Then once you've entered a commit message, we can click commit to make the commit, close the resultant window, and then click push, and that will send the changes over to GitHub. Now we can close the window that pops up and then exit out of that window. Next, we're going to set up our project directory structure. You can create project folders either in your System File Explorer or directly in the RStudio File Explorer over on the right here. And you can do this by clicking Add New Folder. Give your folder a name, which I will call Test Folder, and then click OK. And you can see that that will create a folder for you within the project top level folder. The way that I choose to set up my project directory tree is to switch to the terminal and run a quick one-line shell command. If the terminal tab's not visible next to the console, go to Tools, Terminal, New Terminal, and that will open a new terminal window. Now we can enter the shell command that I spoke about. With this not being a lesson on the Unix shell, I won't explain this command in detail here, but what it does in a single command is to set up the directories and subdirectories for a project that I generally recommend. These are docs for text documents relating to the project, data, which will house our raw data, results, which contain subdirectories for process data in the proc data folder, as well as figures and reports generated for the project in the respective folders, and then finally source, which contains the project source code, so any scripts and markdown files. That's more or less all there is to it in terms of actual project setup. You can now go about starting to add files and folders to the directory hierarchy and make commits to log changes to your project using Git in the exact manner that I showed when I logged the initialization of the project. In future, I'll do a more detailed video on the Git functionality of RStudio in itself, for those of you that are interested in learning more about this. And there's also a couple of other important topics related to project portability and management that I'll also cover in future. So that brings me to the end of this tutorial on starting projects in RStudio. I hope you found it useful, and I hope you have fun with your data analyses, and I'll catch you soon.